Let's turn now to Luke's Gospel, chapter 22 and verse 21. This is Jesus and the disciples seated around the Last Supper in the upper room. And Jesus says, "Behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with me on the table." Judas Iscariot had broken bread and drunk the cup with Jesus and then went out and betrayed him. Betraying Jesus itself was bad enough, but then to symbolically express his covenant relationship with Jesus in this way, in the breaking of bread and the cup, and then to betray him was 100 times worse. To betray a brother or sister in the church is bad enough, but to symbolically testify to one's relationship with them in fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and then to go and betray them is 100 times worse. For indeed the Son of Man is going as it has been determined. God's will be fulfilled as far as Jesus himself is concerned, but the man through whom he is betrayed, woe unto that man. That applies even today. Woe unto the man who betrays his brother or sister. And the wonderful thing here we see is one good thing. Verse 23, they began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be who was going to do this thing. And we know from another gospel, they did not ask, "Lord, is it going to be John, or is it going to be Matthew, or is it going to be Judas?" They said, "Lord, is it I?" A very, very good question to ask at the breaking of bread. Not, "Lord, is it so-and-so, brother so-and-so, or sister so-and-so?" But, "Lord, is it I?" That is the spirit with which we are to come to the Lord's table. "Lord, is it I? Is there something in me?" It's rare to find Christians who live in that spirit all the time. Here is something commendable, really commendable, that we can learn from the disciples. And Judas Iscariot hypocritically also asked, "Lord, is it I?" It's very easy to use the same language. It's very easy to act as though we are judging ourselves. And Judas Iscariot asked the same words, "Lord, is it I?" And Jesus says, "Yes, it is you." May God give us grace to hear when he says to us, "It is you," that we can cleanse ourselves and be prepared for the coming of the Lord. But then we see something else that they discuss there, which is not commendable in the next verse. And there arose, verse 24, a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. Now, we see how from one extreme of spirituality you can sink to the other extreme of carnality in a moment. Here they were judging themselves, asking, "Lord, is it I?" And the next moment they are discussing as to who is going to be the greatest among the 12. In other words, all right, Jesus is going to die. Who's going to take over as the leader? Isn't that something else that was very common in Christendom? When this leader dies, who's going to take over? Or when this leader goes away from the city, who's going to take over? The same dispute that there was there, we find in Christendom for 2,000 centuries. The wonderful thing is, after the day of Pentecost, when they were baptized in the Holy Spirit and they were gripped by their calling to be disciples of Jesus, that question did not arise among them anymore. And it should not be found among the disciples of Jesus today. Jesus had many times told them that the greatest is the one who is like a little child, that the greatest is the one who is a servant of everyone. It's a sad thing that he had to repeat it again just before he went to the cross. There arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was to be regarded to be the greatest. And he said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. Let him who is the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as the servant." That is the way it is in God's kingdom, that the greatest has to become the youngest, and the leader has to become a servant. It's very easy to misunderstand the word servant also. We say, "I'm here to serve God's people." But what does it mean to be a servant? If you really want to understand what it means to be a servant, think of the one who is a servant in your home, who helps in mopping the floor or washing the clothes or doing the odds and ends or working in the kitchen, the one who is out of sight, the one who doesn't take a prominent place, the one who serves the master and the mistress, the one who is in the background, doing all the dirty jobs, and then you understand what it means to be a leader among God's people. It is so much the opposite of what is commonly known as Christian leadership today. Meditate on the servant who works in your home if you want to understand what it is to serve God's people. Otherwise, we shall be, like Jesus said, benefactors. What does it mean to be a benefactor? Verse 25. A benefactor is like a philanthropist who is a very rich man and who gives some money to the poor, and of course that will be advertised in the papers, or a photograph will be taken of him giving that money. And of course he's giving money to the poor, but he gets honor for it, and maybe the poor people also look up to him as the one who has done some great good to me. And the Lord said, you must never serve other people like this, that they have to look up to you as one who has been such a blessing to them and one who has helped them so much. Then it is to be like a benefactor. Let it not be like that among you. That's all right in the world. In the world, the kings and the great men order their slaves around, but not among you. He says, out in the world, the master sits at the table and is served by his servants. Isn't that true? Verse 27. But here, I am your servant. And he was their Lord and he was their servant. And it's not only by exhortation that Jesus tells us how to be leaders, but also by example. God has given us not only words of exhortation in the New Testament, but also the Word become flesh, an example in Jesus. He is the one who washed the disciples' feet at that Last Supper and demonstrated what it is to be a leader. We must never, never lord it over even one of God's people. We are here to serve and to be slaves. And further, in verse 28, he said, you are those who have stood by me in my trials. It's amazing that he could speak those words to people whom he knew were going to forsake him in his hour of need in a few moments. They would all run away. Peter would deny him. The other disciples would forsake him and flee. But yet he says to them, you have stood by me in my trials. He sees that which is good. He thinks of that which is positive and encourages them. And he says to them, just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I grant you, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, verse 30, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he speaks particularly, that of course is going to be in the future, when they are going to sit on the throne in the kingdom of God. Verse 31, he said, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to have you, demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. What do we learn from here? That Satan cannot touch Simon without permission. And that applies to us too. If we are disciples of Jesus, Satan cannot touch us without permission, but he has to ask permission. It says he has asked for permission to sift you like wheat. He came up to God and said, can I sift Simon like wheat? And God gave Satan permission, just like God gave Satan permission to test Job in the Old Testament. Satan couldn't touch Job without God's permission. In fact, Satan himself said in Job chapter 1 that God had placed a hedge around Job. Satan recognized that. We need to recognize God's placed a hedge around us, but sometimes God allows that hedge to be open so that Satan can come through and test us up to a certain point. But we have this wonderful promise in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that God will never allow us to be tested beyond our ability. And so we see here that Satan has to get permission from God every time he allows some trial or some testing to come into our life. It may be a physical trial, it may be persecution, it may be touching the hair on our head, it may be a temptation to sin. In this case, Peter was being tempted, not by physical persecution, but he was going to be tested to sin by denying the Lord. And God gave Satan permission We can ask, why did God give Satan permission when he knew that Peter is going to fail and fall? That was also necessary. Failure is also necessary in order to break us. Simon Peter was broken at the end of that failure so thoroughly that he repented and mourned and wept, and that brokenness turned him into a very gentle man of God. And so we see something wonderful here, that God uses Satan sometimes to try us and test us, and he even allows us to fail. It's not God's will that we should fail, but when we do fail, like Simon Peter, God can turn even that to good by allowing that failure to break us and to humble us. So God turns the evil that Satan does against us to good. That is the God we worship. And how does that happen? It says here in verse 32, I have prayed for you. The sifting is only going to sift out the chaff, because it says here you're going to be sifted, verse 31, like wheat. The wheat is not going to be lost. It's only the chaff that's going to be lost. And so when Satan tests us, or puts some pressure on us, or tries us, it's only the chaff that's going to drop off. The wheat will remain. But he says here, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. That's wonderful. Our faith will not fail. He's not saying that we shouldn't lose our money. Jesus never prays for that. But our faith should never be lost. And how are we protected? By Jesus' intercession for us, even today. Like he prayed for Peter, we read in Hebrews 7:25 that he ever lives to intercede for us also. And that's why we are preserved. And he prays that our faith will not fail. Whatever else we may lose. We may lose our health, we may lose our wealth, but our faith should not fail. And once we have gone through that period of testing, he says, strengthen your brothers. I know you will come through this. And when we have come through a trial, what is the purpose? What is the purpose of trial? That we might be strengthened in order to strengthen our brothers and sisters. So let's look to the Lord in faith and not lose faith in the time of trial, so that we can be a strength to our brothers and sisters in the church.